Hello, everybody. Welcome to this channel, Hiie Somatics. My name is Hiie. I am currently in Paris, France, and today's episode is with Julia Rice. Welcome to this little studio here, and thank you so much for joining us. Julia, can you tell us a little bit about what you do and your experiences with movement and dance? I know.
I'm a dance movement therapist. I've been practicing for a bit over 40 years. To be certified and registered as a dance movement therapist, you need some background in technical dance. So I have a background in both ballet and modern dance. My current movement stuff I practice is I'm a pretty avid yoga practitioner and have been practicing Iyengar yoga for 23 some years and been to India a couple times to study and take classes probably 4 or 5 times a week, and the other days practice on my own.
And you started talking about your experiences with performance also, or like tell us about that.
The topic of fear was a spectacular one in that I am someone who has always feared and not liked performing. When I had to do choreography in college, generally I choreographed so my back was to the audience, or I had a hat over my face or something. So I wasn't aware of the audience. And I have a fair amount of fear about doing presentations and talking in public. It
Yeah,
took me many years to get comfortable doing groups.
this is perfect. You know, synchronicities are a
Yes.
wonderful thing. It's very special that you are here with us today, because the topic, as you mentioned also for our discussion today, is like fear of movement or discomfort when it comes to movement, or anything that blocks us from expressing ourselves freely in the body, or something that blocks us from enjoying movement in life, even just as walkers on the streets, or something, as people who walk
Mm-hmm.
or something like this. So let's see how to start this discussion. Do you want to tell us more about your experience with fear of movement? Or maybe if you want to, you can also tell us about what you see in terms of these kinds of emotional difficulties when you teach your classes, or when you do like dance therapy sessions. I leave this up to you. Either way is fine.
It's a tricky topic because fear is part of our warning system. And part of my job as a clinician is to help people appreciate and become attuned with their warning system, but not to be ruled by messages that aren't accurate. So part of the deal is not really about removing fear, but about respecting, talking with, challenging fear a little bit. The acceptance and commitment therapists tell the story of that it's okay to have your uncomfortable emotion, in this case fear. It just doesn't get to drive. You put it in the seat next to you, put the seatbelt on, and you're driving, and you take your fear with you. You don't need to get rid of it, but you do need to proceed on. So part of the work I do is about not having fear stop you, but inform you.
But in your kind of work, what kinds of fears do people have when they come to your classes? And do they talk about it openly, or how do you even know that they have some kind of fear in them?
I usually do a pretty thorough introduction before I do a group and give people enormous amounts of permission to not do things and talk about how important it is to practice saying no to an authority like your therapist, and to honor your body and what your body is saying to you. But I also say to them, my job is to encourage you. So you will say no to me, and I will probably ask you at least twice. And it's not that I'm ignoring your no, but I will continue to invite you even though you are uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. I also have a very broad definition of movement. Um, I think that there are at least three levels movement happens on. One is the thing we see, the movement we see, the movement we can describe and agree. Julia raised her right hand, that sort of stuff. The other is the sort of symbolic piece of you see me raising my hand and I actually think I'm raising a sword or doing something else, that there's an imaginal part of that movement or an imagery part of that movement. And then there's just that piece of what it means to me, what it feels like, what it means to me. And I think that when people engage in movement, they don't actually have to discernibly be moving, to my observation. That if you've ever seen Paris Olympics, okay, the Olympic athletes preparing right before they go on, often they sit pretty still and maybe move their hands a little and go through in their mind what the movement's going to be. And there's pretty good data that actually charges those muscles and nerves, so that I can see someone appearing to be still and they can tell me in their imaginary movement it was rich and deep and they felt it. And it's also a way to include people who perhaps don't have a great range of movement or have some physical limitations. Is, I think, even imagining the movement gives someone some of that experience of what movement can bring them.
I think that's a great idea. And as I listen to you, I also feel like something like this can also help people reduce their fear of movement. Also, like, okay, maybe you don't do it right away, but imagine doing it. I think that would really calm me down also.
Yeah.
If I had movement, a certain kind of movement, or like opening myself up in vulnerable ways through movement in the presence of other people.
Yeah, I'm pretty willing to do what I need to do to help someone. So I've done things as that sound as silly as, I will say, I will close my eyes while you move, and I'll hear the sound of your movement around me, or you can move behind me and I promise not to turn around if you just want to practice being in a room with someone and moving. So there are a lot of structures as a clinician I can come up with that give people a broader range of choices than I want you to do a couple pliés.
Yes. It just occurred to me, Julie, as I was listening to you, that maybe there are some listeners who don't really have a very good sense of, well, what would happen in a dance movement therapy, dance therapy session? Could you give us a little description? So, for example, I come to your session, what happens?
Um,
Am I in the
we
group with
would,
other people? Are we by the two of us? And what is a typical session like, if there is a typical session?
I worked both individually and in groups, but I'll go with groups because that's kind of my passion and my love. That in a movement group, I would take a fair amount of time to explain what I was doing, why I was doing it, reassure people that I would not be asking them to do anything I myself had not done or tried, and that they could challenge me on that at any point in time. Set safety parameters about the room and about interactions with one another and about being able to say no and being listened to if you say no. I generally do some kind of movement warm up in a group, partly to warm up, but partly to give people a little taste of a slightly expanded movement vocabulary. To really, yeah, I will be watching people in the group and watching how they are moving, how they are breathing, and I will try to, in the movement warm up, include things that I see might be missing from their what I've observed in their movement range, or stretching something I've seen is already present. So I will be gathering lots of data while we do a warm up. Sometimes I'll pass leadership to other people. It can take lots of forms. Usually I do some sort of main thing. I trained as a Jungian for quite a while, so often it will be some type of Jungian dichotomy or Jungian framed piece of work, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. And that usually hour and a half is about as long as a session goes. Did that answer the question? I'm not sure.
I think that is very helpful for people to imagine, because I think there's a lot of, we just don't know what these kinds of sessions look like. So for example, me, I write and teach, I write about and I teach somatic movement practices. And then people who are in the world of somatics, they know what happens.
Mhm.
But then for other people, somatic dance, it doesn't, I have to explain to them also what the principles are, and the feeling in the classroom, the lack of judgment, and the opportunity to follow your own, to get to know your own body actually, and to follow the sensations.
As dance is a huge love for me, and I suspect for you too. We're both fine with that word, but one of the things I find is clients get absolutely terrified of the word dance, thinking that somehow they're going to be putting on tutus and point shoes and prancing about the room. So a lot of my work is soothing that.
See, there you go. That's the first step actually in talking about dance, is the very word itself, and the baggage that, or the, not the baggage, but the conception that we bring to the very word. And I think it's really, that's really actually dangerous and so hard to break when it comes to men also, it's like, it's so hard to get men to come to these, or to invite them in, because immediately, oh, no, I'm not a dancer. This is for performance. This is for all this. Yeah.
Kind of anecdotally, one of the things my partner Mary Lee and I discovered over the years of doing groups together is that providing a wide range of props in the room helps men often be more comfortable, because they can have something they're using or moving or working with, and it seems that that aids in comfort. And if we don't provide them, they'll just make them, grab their shoe and do something with their shoe or their jacket or the chair.
Oh, how interesting. I remember once here in Paris, we went to a nightclub, and there was a very good a dancer, a friend of mine, mm, uh, a man, and I was like, "Oh, you dance really well. You're so free in your movement. Like, what do you do? Like, how did you get there?" And he said, every time that I dance, I imagine that I have like a sword, and I'm dancing with the sword."
Oh,
It's like, that's a great idea. We can bring these kinds of images into our free dance also, as men. I think that would be interesting too, for them to explore a dimension like that too.
yeah, yeah. The
Sometimes.
other piece is, go
Mhm, sorry.
ahead.
Yeah,
Is the you go, I will be quiet.
no, all I was going to say was that sometimes I'm like, okay, what do I use then as a word instead of dance? Like movement, somatic movement, therapeutic movement. Sometimes I use creative movement, but I think in the US also creative movement is associated with movement for like young people and kids. And so sometimes that doesn't work either. It's hard to come up with a word that captures the many nuances of dance, but also doesn't evoke the fear that many
Mhm.
people have when it comes to dancing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's true is we are all moving bodies. All of us move. Every time I breathe, I move. And sometimes I will talk to clients about, even though you feel you're not moving, I can observe the changes in your body as you breathe. I can see your ribs move. I can see movement. You coming into the room was movement. So, in some ways, we've already established that all of us in this room had to move to get into this room and move to get into our chairs, and likely are moving and squirming in our chairs right now as they listen to me.
Mm. That's true. Oh, that's great. Well, this is a topic for discovery also. I wanted to ask you something really excellent that you mentioned earlier when we started to talk about fear. You said, so this is a very it's not an accurate paraphrasing, but the idea was something like, I help, that is you. I help people discern between messages that are accurate and messages that aren't accurate when it comes to unpleasurable sensations, for example. And I think, like for example, so what part of me is operating because of fear, and what part of me is actually really noticing something in my body that is a no, don't do this. And I feel like that is so difficult to teach, or to maybe even sense in my own body sometimes. So for example, when I teach strength training and flexibility classes, somatically inclined, I feel like a lot of people are afraid of, let's say, using heavier weights, or
Mm-hmm.
because they feel like, well, what if I injure myself, or I'm going to get exhausted, or maybe no, this is hurting me. And then it's even to discern between the hurt, the pain. It's not really, well, the feeling of the muscle contracting and releasing, and then the pain that is actually, well, now it's really time to stop. I think it's so hard. And also for people, or sometimes can be hard. And for people also who have experienced injuries and traumas and things like this. So long story short, how do we teach people, and even ourselves actually, to make these discernments? Like, okay, this is really something I shouldn't do, or no, I'm actually, this is a fear inside of myself. It's my ego or my brain saying something that's actually not really the real experience of
Mm-hmm.
the physical body.
One of the things that's been most helpful to me personally is to really be aware of how I talk to and describe the movement in my inner dialogue. And one of the things I've worked on in the past couple of years for myself is to use the word sensation instead of the word pain, to really start distinguishing between I'm having a sensation that I'm uncomfortable with in my left arm versus my left arm hurts. And to part of my job, I believe, as a therapist, is to help people tolerate the unavoidable discomforts physically and emotionally that happen in our day-to-day life, and to give them a larger range of coping strategies. And I think those coping strategies can be both cognitive and physical. Mary Lee and I used to talk about how emotional and physical flexibility correspond one to one within our range. And sometimes it's helping someone get enough range physically that they have more emotional range. And often that's one of the kind of sneaky ways movement therapy works, is it allows people to experience in their body things that are new and sometimes uncomfortable that they wouldn't want to go to cognitively.
Mm-hmm. That is very interesting. As I was listening to you, I was thinking about yogic practices also, for example, and how in
Mm-hmm.
yoga, Kundalini yoga or other types of yoga, uh, we do movements that purposefully last for, I don't know, like 11 minutes, 10 minutes, 40 minutes, same kind of movement in Kundalini yoga. And one of the aims is to really is to tolerate the discomfort and to kind of go beyond, or to actually like deal with these
Mm-hmm.
emotional fears into when it comes to getting into certain poses, for example. But there too is a tricky thing. Do I want to push myself into going into this pose to reduce my fear, or actually do I listen to the real feelings, sensations in my body that tell me, no, this is not for you to do this movement? Actually, where
And
was
the
it?
answer would be different from day to day.
Day to day? Yeah, okay, that's a good way of putting it too. And I
I
remember. Mhm, go ahead.
When one of my favorite fear stories about me is some years back, I was in yoga class with my teacher, and he is a man I've worked with for several decades now. And I shuffled up to him with tears running down my face, saying, "You don't want me to do that, do you?" And he looked at me and he said, "Julia, it's just fear. Go and do it."
Okay.
And
See?
it in the context of my relationship, it was the right thing to say, and it gave me support, and it also challenged me. And I think that's the piece that is the therapy in dance movement therapy, is I need to have enough awareness to know I'm the one in charge, and I'm the one who makes, in some ways, the choice of, do I push someone, do I back off, do we stop and process? And that's a piece of the skill of being a good dance movement therapist, is knowing when to stop and honor the fear, when to challenge the fear, when to dance with or play with the fear. It also can make a kind of interesting playmate in sessions.
Ah, yes, to have like a free dance. I've done this with anxiety myself.
Yeah.
as a force. Okay, sometimes it's such a big presence in my life. So okay, how can I dance with it? What is it telling me? But I haven't thought of doing it that with fear also, and to talk to my fears. Yes, it's
Yeah.
this conversation is very interesting also because in somatics, in the kinds of practices that I teach, for example, we teach people to follow and to find like pleasure, because we find also that it's
Mhm.
difficult for people to understand what is a pleasurable movement. Actually, that sensation is not so easy to find either sometimes.
Yeah.
Pleasure, to kind of soothe the nervous system, also sometimes to challenge it and to like give it different impulses. But we don't talk so much, excuse me, we don't talk so much about mm, like purposefully creating uncomfortable situations to see how we can face them. It's an interesting dimension that is a little bit less present, I think, in somatics.
I think that's a piece of the difference of a contract in a somatics class or practice and a therapy session. That when someone hires me to be their therapist, they are in some ways hiring me to challenge them. There's some sort of problem or some sort of issue we need to find our way through. So, in some ways, entering into a therapy session implies some sort of challenging is going to happen at some point during the session where the therapist isn't doing their job.
Right, there's an intent to change
Yeah.
or something. Yes, in somatics, some challenge, there are plenty of things that can be challenging. In Nia, for example, we have new routines, new kinds of movements, or new kinds of music to also challenge our like cognitive
Mhm.
function, to learn something new, to not always do the same things, and to actually dance to music that sometimes maybe we don't like. And so there are
Yeah.
plenty of other ways in which we can bring this issue of challenging. I like it very much. I've been recently reading about, like discipline and just like doing things, even if we don't like them so much, and to find the inner force,
Mhm.
these kinds of things. So maybe this is a nice segue also to, let's talk about courage also. Let's talk about the other side of the coin too. Would you think, for example, that we can use movement to build courage? How does it happen? And what have you
I
seen in
think
client stories?
absolutely for both myself and my clients that having the confidence that your body will carry you through whatever situation without breaking or failing or falling apart inherently builds courage. Doing things physically out in the world. One of the things that seems to happen with people with trauma is they live in, like, best way I can describe is they live in a little tiny room in the back of their head. They've abandoned their body because if they cut off sensation and body awareness, then they won't feel the pain of being harmed. So a piece of the work starts out with how can you be present in your body and practice doing that without being harmed. And sometimes for people with really extraordinarily difficult trauma histories, sitting in a movement therapy group and watching is a way they can start practicing being aware of their body, being present in their body for bits of time, and being safe and not having anything horrible happen to them. But it takes a while to rebuild that sense of my body can be my safe place seems antithetical to someone who has been traumatized physically. It's like, no, that's what got hurt. So, in a way, helping people even find their body, the practices I'm sure you do and I do that have to do with body awareness are part of building that courage and capacity to be physically present and safe simultaneously.
I think that's a great idea also. This feeling, like how to cultivate in us the feeling in ourselves, the feeling of like I can trust my body, because yeah, I
Mhm.
think many people have had the, well, my body has failed me, or I don't, it's not a place that I can trust, feel safe in.
Or it's too vulnerable. Having a body is inherently vulnerable.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
there is a huge piece of that. I mean, you used the word courage earlier, and I was going to say, I really, as I thought about the questions you sent me, I was playing with whether I believe courage is the opposite of fear. And
Yeah.
I think that's really idiosyncratic from person to person. For some people, absolutely. For some people, safety is the opposite of fear. For some people, excitement is the opposite of fear. That I think that we're all idiosyncratic enough, even though fear is a core emotion and in a way, a survival instinct. It's more personal what we find is the opposite to that emotion. And it's going to be different for different people.
Mhm. That's right. Do you have any suggestions to us, to the listeners, to me, about how to build courage and how to use the body or movement as a way to build courage?
Let me think. I have a bunch of thoughts all at once, and choosing is sometimes a challenge for
Tell
me.
them all. We need courage in our lives, so the more the more pieces of advice we have, the better.
One of the simplest movement things I sometimes do with people is have them start with a kind of a small rocking motion forward and back, and let it get larger, whether they're standing or sitting, till it's past a little bit where they're comfortable, and then they come back and go, and they use rhythm as a guide through discomfort, like the rhythm of the movement. It will take me back. And even though there's a scary moment, and then the even scarier one of going side to side and practicing going further than they want, and then letting themselves come back and going further than they want, practicing going past where their edge is, and in a way, playfully and rhythmically finding their way back to increase that range. And I'm going to go again with increased physical range correlates to increased emotional range. So anytime I can increase someone's range physically, I'm also, the same neuromuscular pathways share emotion and movement. I am making way for larger range of emotion. Does that
Uh-huh.
make sense?
What else?
Um,
If there's anything.
you mentioned anxiety earlier, and I think anxiety and fear have a really intimate relationship. They're certainly first degree relatives. And sometimes one of the things people who I work with fear is that if they were to fully be in touch with their emotions, they would destroy the world, that they are somehow saving others by not accessing their rage or their fear or any of those emotions, because they are destructive powers that could in some ways destroy the universe. One of the things I will have people do is get in a position where they're facing the wall, their feet are apart, their knees are bent, their arms are shoulder height, and they press with all of their passionate might against the wall, trying to actually move the sheetrock. And it'll move a teeny weeny bit. And then instead of stopping, they slowly back off. And then they slowly press. And they slowly back off, challenging that idea, A, that their force is so strong that it is destructive, and B, helping them learn how to do sustained movement, which in some ways is a little safer. I think when harm happens, often it's when it escalates and people get faster and the hitting starts, or those things start, and that the sustained going in and out. The other thing it does is it tires them out a little bit. It's when one gets anxious, when one gets afraid, one creates chemicals in their body, and you're not going to stop feeling the intensity of the sensations till the chemicals wear down. You just can't. So sometimes movement, and I'll say movement is a way to quickly get rid of some of those chemicals so you can calm down. But once they're created, you can't calm down. I have issue with people who say, just sit down and meditate if you're feeling really anxious or really afraid. I'm like, no, move intensely with your arms above your head and do stuff.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great advice. Also, piece of advice. Yes. Mm. Okay, great. Earlier you mentioned the word challenge, and I really also like like that word also, and like bringing that more into our lives also, like challenging ourselves to do, I don't know, try movement classes or experiences that maybe are not immediately familiar to us. Like, why not? And see, like, I feel like a lot of us, well, I'm maybe talking about myself, eh, we're such perfectionists in our heads also, thinking, well,
Mhm.
I should be this and this and this, or this and this shape, or this and this age to go and try a class, you know?
It's it's really, really hard sometimes. I sometimes in groups I'll say to people, I want everyone to do a movement or be in a posture that breaks a family rule. And they're like, "What are you talking about? I don't know what you mean." And I'll go first. I'll say, "Well, in my family, girls had to keep their knees together. We had to sit upright, and we generally had to look friendly. That scowling was not something that was accepted, and having my legs wide open wasn't accepted. So for me, breaking a family rule would be slumping and having my legs open and my face scowling. And people can start saying, oh, we had this rule about posture, we had this rule about facial expressions that were okay, and that it's a way to start people noticing what their blocks are. Because I think sometimes it's not fear, it's habit. And we call it fear,
Mhm.
but it's a habit we learned early on. And we might not even still be in that situation or have the beliefs that gave birth to that thing, but we haven't been able to look at it, examine it, and get rid of it.
I think that's a great idea. I was recently talking to a student of mine who said, I told her, I'm interested in fear of movement. And she said, well, I don't really have fear of movement when I am in your classes, but I just feel like I'm ignorant. I simply don't, it doesn't occur to me to do these types of movements. I'm not afraid of them. I just don't know. I love the idea that maybe what's holding us back sometimes is not really fear, it's habit. How do I know? How do I what's my question? Like, how do I find out that it's a habit and not a fear? How do I
Um, you'll get immediate feedback from yourself by pushing against it a little.
oh, yeah?
And sometimes, getting a little esoteric, sometimes in my head, in a client's head, um, the voice telling them the rule is a clue. If it's my mother's voice saying sit up straight, it might have nothing to do with what I believe at all. But I've just integrated that in and believe that, even though I know my mother is sometimes wrong. I know it's okay to break family rules. So sometimes how it comes to you, like whose voice the
Yeah.
rule comes in, is a clue about whether it's something you believe or something that your family believe that you are able to let go of.
Yes. Oh, that's an excellent point also, because sometimes I feel like I as a young mover, as a child, I picked up a lot of fear of movement from my well-meaning, very loving, kind parents who wanted to protect me
Yes.
from falling from this and this and this. But I think as a result of that, and as a kind of maybe my own natural inclination also, like a lot of movements for me immediately felt scary, because I was like, well, what if something happens and I don't have the balance?
Mhm.
I'm gonna fall down. And do you have it?
I have, yeah, I have the luxury of, for many, many years, I worked in a hospital, and I use humor a fair amount because it's just part of my personality. But I would say one of the lovely things is we are actually in a hospital, and God forbid something awful would happen, but we are like 30 feet from an emergency room. I will keep you safe, but if anything bad happens, you are like in the world's best place to try something new, because you have trained clinicians, you have doctors, you have an emergency room. So this is as safe as it's going to be for taking a risk or trying something new.
Yes. On that note, I also one of my friends, going back to this idea of challenge and challenging ourselves in terms of movement also, he told me, and he's a young man in his 40s, and he's very muscular. He does a lot of like strength training, and he is
Mhm.
a former military person, a veteran. He's very strong,
Yeah.
very. And so he told me once that he tried a ballet class. And I said, oh,
Oh,
so what made you go to a ballet class? And he said, I was walking down the streets. here in Paris, and then I saw the sign saying, "Oh, we offer ballet classes." And immediately he said, my thought was, "Well, this is not for me. I'm not going to do it." And then he said, "Well, wait a second. I'm going to do this precisely because I had this fear or this voice inside of myself that this was not for me." And so he went. And then
Yes.
he had a great time. It wasn't easy, but he said, "Well, actually, the ballet class was very much like my strength training experience, because in both you see people are putting their bodies through this immense challenge to
Mhm.
get somewhere." So I found that story to be very inspiring also. It's the idea of like getting also with movement, like outside of our comfort zones a little bit.
And I think that the ballet was a wonderful example to bring up because in some ways, people feel safest in structure if they know what's going to happen. And one of the things I know for sure in a ballet class is we're going to do pliés first, we're going to do some tendus, we're going to do some rond de jambes. It is so gloriously well structured that there is safety in that. And I think that's a piece of what happens as someone gets used to you in a movement class or a movement group is there's safety in knowing, oh, I know her. This is what she does. She'll have me do this and then she'll have me do this. And I've survived it before. So
Yeah.
some of it is practice, just getting used to and developing safety enough with who you're working with that you're willing to go the next step and the next step and the next step.
Yes, there's power in repetition also, just simply showing
Oh.
up and doing it again and not getting discouraged. And also, I think like developing, this is what I'm feeling in my life recently, like developing a strong inner coach, a strong private inner coach who's like, "Come on, you can do this." This kind of voice in myself. Because
Yeah, I have a
I wish I had that inner coach when I was younger, and
yeah.
when it comes to movement in particular, because yeah. It was challenging being a young person and feeling like the sports classes in my school, they were all about competition and it was nothing mind body.
Mhm. No. I think that one of the things I can help people do is ask different questions. You brought up a couple times in different ways the asking yourself the question kind of, do I want to do this? Do I feel like it? And I think in some ways that's a really dangerous question. Like, I don't ask myself, do I feel like getting up in the morning? I actually get up in the morning.
Yeah.
Um, and sometimes for me, I call them clients. Clients need to know that it's okay to do things you don't want to do and let the other person know you don't want to do them and then do them. Um, I would wait the rest of my life before I felt like cleaning the kitty litter, but I do it pretty regularly because it's part of my contract with my cats. But asking myself, do I feel like doing it gets into a dangerous cascade of resistance and inner dialogue. And sometimes you try something and you don't ask yourself if you want to do it.
Yes, exactly. It goes back to this. Yeah. I recently had an interview with with a strength training expert, private trainer.
Mhm.
He's like, it's a non-negotiable. Like, okay, maybe a few times you tell yourself, "I'm really exhausted, I really cannot do it." But then it's like those are a few single instances, and then
Yeah.
you go back to it again. Like it's just something you do. It's whatever practice, physical practice one has in one's life.
Yeah. And you cannot want to do it while doing it.
Yes.
There are certainly times I don't want to get up and take my walk every morning, and I cannot want to do it while I walk the entire 2 miles. I
Hmm.
don't ever have to want to do it. I simply am doing it. And I think sometimes people get afraid, back to fear, that if they don't want to do something, they shouldn't, or they can't, or they won't.
Right. On this note a little bit, let me come back to, I somehow feel like still that some of the listeners maybe are not very familiar with dance therapy. Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
So if I come to dance therapy, does that mean that I have to have some kind of trauma inside of myself that I want to improve through or resolve through a movement? Like what kind of person do I need to be to come to dance
Okay.
therapy? like what motivates people to come? I feel like, well, maybe if you told me that anybody can come to dance therapy, then maybe I would come also. But currently, I think it's very therapy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is a therapy modality. I work as a primary therapist with people struggling with psychological issues. That's the bottom line in there. Um, all you really need is probably a body, and most of us have those. But there's this piece of, it's a form of therapy, and it used to be we would talk a lot about this is a wonderful form of therapy for people who struggle with words, and for people who are a little less verbal, or in the old days, people who were struggling more with chronic and persistent mental illness. And what I found is many of the clients I work with are people who are so articulate, the words form a wall, and talking with them just redoes and redoes and redoes the same thing, and that having them work on a physical level, work in movement, allows them to get away from that cascade of beautifully articulate words that are actually in and of themselves a form of resistance.
I think that's a great idea, because I gravitate to movement also because I'm very verbal too. I
You
write,
are.
my background is in academics also. And I remember when I first started doing like somatic movement, it was, I don't have to think and listen to my language in these classes. It was so restful for me to be in a modality where I don't need the words. I can rest from the words.
And I think that happens more and more, certainly in my culture. My guess is in your culture too, that we get flooded with words all the time and have very little chance to allow our bodies to process and ourselves to be with ourselves before more stimuli comes in. And the lovely thing about movement is we can teach it in a way, or help people do it in a way where they're not responding to external stimuli, they're responding to what's inside of them instead of all the things going on outside of them.
Yes, and the visual stimuli also. And
Yeah.
let me ask you this also. Now, I don't know if is this a question in dance therapy? Maybe it isn't. I feel like maybe it's more of a question for practices where there is less liberty in choosing movements. But my
Right.
question is about like learning styles, and maybe again going back a little bit to like childhood experiences with movement. And
Mhm.
for example, I felt like certain types of movements in my childhood that I wasn't able to do, let's say in a gym class, I wasn't able to do them, not necessarily even because of fear, but I felt like people my teachers didn't explain those movements to me, or didn't show them, or didn't like, I simply needed more time, and I needed
Mhm.
somebody to like, okay, here, let's break these movements down for you, and this is how you do it. But at school, everybody was, oh, you can do it, la la, like it was just like one type of movement learner, and I feel like, okay, in academic types of classrooms, maybe not even there, but how to bring in more awareness of how we also process movement differently, learn movement differently,
Mhm.
kind of attention to neurodivergence or neurodifference, or how different brains function. Do you encounter that sometimes in your work also, like the need to take into consideration different people's tempos with learning, or
Absolutely. That's a part of the skill of being a good therapist, is being able to work at the pace that works for your client, and to, that old chestnut, meet them where they're at, and allow what develops to be theirs, and not my agenda of what they should be able to do, or what developmental milestone they should be reaching. Sometimes with folks who really are struggling in that way, we do something called developmental movement, where we go through very early childhood developmental movement patterns, and practice them. One of the strangely most rewarding things I do with adults is have everyone lay on their stomachs, put their head on their hands, and then look up and peek. And I set the structure that you have to find a way to make eye contact with everyone in this group by peeking. And some people are going to be really hard to get, but you have to make eye contact with everyone. And in a weird way, it takes away the fear of eye contact because it's a game and you're playing it. And then we talk about how therapy and relationships are like that kind of peekaboo, where I'll show you a little bit of me and then I'm going to close down and I'm going to be safe and I'm going to wait. Then I'm going to take another risk and show you a little bit more of me. And that's an early development. I mean, peekaboo is a pretty early developmental pattern or early developmental movement. And that having people get on the floor and sometimes do those really early movements, rocking, peekaboo, all sorts of things, starts helping people grow up from that spot in a way. Sometimes people get arrested in their movement development by rules, by religion. We haven't talked about religion. We're very careful here. But certainly religions have rules about bodies and what shows and what doesn't show and what you can do and what you can't do. So sometimes people have never had the chance to experience it because they're being brought up by people who never felt comfortable in their bodies. So you go back to the floor and back to early developmental movement.
I love it. I think this is such an interesting topic. I feel like maybe we need to do another conversation about this. The idea of arrested, how we get arrested in our development as movers. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that motivated this whole episode actually, which was I feel like I have these, I call them like my movement traumas, which
Yes.
it doesn't mean that I am now a traumatized person, but I feel like something in my movement story has been really, there's an early experience with something that has really changed who I am as a mover, and then there's a later. In other words, I also want people to actually, if I can add something here, to think about their like movement story also. Like,
yeah.
For example, I can think of my life as, the love stories of my life, or my story of traveling, but what is my story of movement? When did certain practices come into my life? When did I feel, and because of what did I feel like I need to stop moving in certain ways, and who taught me what about movement? And it's interesting that you mentioned also like the importance of like early caregivers and religion and these settings.
Yes. Yeah, it's a safe place to go to stuck spots and come to a different conclusion other than stop, or I shouldn't, or that's bad. That it really gives people a chance to reconsider those things.
That sounds really powerful. Also, it sounds like your sessions are so much fun. Also, like you do fun things. There's humor, there's discovery through like gay, like playful activities. Also, like it's interesting to look at
I
emotion
think if
from a sense too.
I think if you were to ask people who worked with me, they would say that I am as forceful as I am kind, and that I think that that's part of how I found to work, is that I can offer love and compassion and acceptance, which means I can also offer challenge and have it be safe. That if I were only challenging people or only loving people, neither of those actually meet all the needs.
Yes. On that note, if people want to find you, maybe we start wrapping up here. If people want to find you, how do they find you? If they want to like schedule a meeting with you or want to come to your sessions, I'll put
I
this.
am I am currently not working.
Oh, okay.
I am currently pretty much retired. I might come out of retirement at some point, but for right now, I'm pretty much retired.
Okay. I see. Well, that's great. Then you're all ours.
Yes,
For
absolutely.
sharing the experience that you've gathered over the years and the inspiration that you can give us. Julia, is there something that you want to add that I didn't ask you about?
Let me see. I have a couple notes. Let me peek. I think probably my bottom line is that, as we talked about the difference between sensation and pain, any uncomfortable emotions don't mean stop. They sometimes mean go or explore, or they can take you somewhere. And I'm not as interested as removing fear as helping people find a way to have a relationship with their fear that is mutually respectful and responsive.
This is a powerful idea. The idea also of like moving a little bit toward fear too. Like because the things that make us fearful might not be bad for us. So
Or they
they're
might be exciting. I have a therapist friend who says over and over the difference between fear and excitement is how we anticipate the outcome.
the difference between fear and excitement is how we
anticipate the outcome. This new thing is going to be terrible. I'm going to die. It's awful. I can't do it. Or this new thing's exciting. I've never done it before. I wonder what will happen. And it's the same new thing, but it's this piece of how I narrate my story to myself has a huge impact on what emotions I have about it.
how I narrate my story to myself has a huge impact on the emotions that I have about it. I love this idea. This was such a useful, impactful interview. I got so many ideas for myself. I felt it was so inspiring also to talk to you, to hear you talk about. I feel to talk about courage and fear and things like this.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so very much for your time and for your wisdom.
And thank you very much for helping me challenge one of my fears.
Yes. We're all helping each other with our fears. It's very true.
Yes.
And thank you, dear listeners, for joining us. And then we'll see what the next episode brings. Bye-bye, everybody.